They ask me sometimes, the ones who have never seen it, and I tell them the same thing every time. It is not like watching a fire consume a forest, though that metaphor tempts the tongue. It is not like watching a flood devour a valley, nor a plague spread through a city's veins. Those are disasters that belong to the realm of human comprehension. Tragedies that carry with them the weight of cause and consequence, the possibility of prevention, the hope of rebuilding. What I watched was none of these things. What I watched was a world being eaten, and the difference between that and any other catastrophe is the difference between dying and being digested. My name is Aldrin Voss. I was born on Colthran IV, a modest agri-world in the Segmentum Pacificus, 63 standard years ago. For 31 of those years, I served in the Planetary Distribution Authority, eventually rising to the position of Regional Logistics Coordinator for the Northern Agricultural Belt. I managed grain shipments, water allocation, fertilizer distribution, and labor rotation schedules. I knew the tithe calculations by heart. I could tell you to the kilogram how much protein wheat our region produced in any given quarter, how many mouths it fed across a dozen systems, how many Imperial citizens would go hungry if our harvest failed by even 3%. I was a functionary, a cog in the Imperium's vast digestive system, processing the endless data of production and distribution so that humanity might continue its eternal war against the darkness. I tell you this not because it matters, but because you must understand what I was before you can understand what I became. You must understand that I was a man of spreadsheets and allocation reports, of cargo manifests and transit schedules. I believed in the system. I believed that if everyone did their small part, contributed their small piece to the great machine, the Imperium would endure. I believed that order and structure could hold back the chaos that gnawed at the edges of the galaxy. I believed many things, once. Now I believe only in the silence that comes after, and the weight of having survived it. The first sign came in the form of a report from the outer monitoring stations, 14 weeks before the end. I remember the exact moment I received it, sitting at my desk in the regional administration building, the morning light filtering through dust motes that danced in the recycled air. The report was flagged as anomalous but non-urgent, one of perhaps 200 such reports I received daily. Equipment malfunction, atmospheric interference, solar flares. There were always explanations for the strange readings that came from the void. The monitoring stations existed to track incoming cargo vessels and potential pirate activity, and their sensors were notoriously temperamental. When Station Omicron 7 reported a shadow in the void, a mass that should not have been there, I noted the anomaly and forwarded it to the appropriate department. I did not lose sleep over it. I did not even remember it by the time I went home that evening. The shadow grew. It took 2 weeks for the next report to reach my desk, this one flagged as priority but still not urgent. Multiple stations were now detecting the anomaly. It was moving, they said. It was vast. The best estimates put it at somewhere between 3 and 5 astronomical units in diameter, though the exact measurements fluctuated wildly depending on which station was doing the measuring. I remember thinking that must be an error. Nothing could be that large and move with such purpose. I filed the report and went about my work. There was a grain shipment delayed at the southern transit hub, and the tithe collectors were growing impatient. I had real problems to solve. I think about that often now, in the long hours before sleep finally claims me. I think about the grain shipment and the impatient tithe collectors, about how I worried over quota percentages while something vast and hungry was drifting toward us through the endless dark. I wonder if there is a point at which knowledge would have changed anything, if there is some threshold of awareness that might have altered our fate. I do not believe there is. The Imperium had classified information about the Xenos threat, data compiled from 100 consumed worlds, and none of it had saved those worlds from their fate. Knowledge is not salvation. Sometimes knowledge is merely the ability to name the thing that kills you. The children were the first to know. I noticed them in the 3rd week, though I did not understand what I was noticing until much later. There was a school adjacent to the administration building, a grey concrete structure where the children of functionaries and laborers received their basic Imperial education. I passed it every morning on my way to work, and every evening on my way home. The children had always played in the courtyard during their recreation periods, their shouts and laughter a constant background noise that I had long since learned to ignore. But in the third week, the courtyard fell silent. The children still emerged during their recreation periods, still gathered in the courtyard beneath the pale sun, but they no longer played. They stood in loose clusters, facing outward, staring at the sky. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply watched, as if waiting for something they could not name but somehow knew was coming. I asked one of the teachers about it, a tired woman with grey hair and the permanent squint of someone who has spent too many years reading student reports under inadequate lighting. She shrugged and said the children had been having nightmares. Many of them, she said, were refusing to sleep. They spoke of a hunger in their dreams, a vast and patient hunger that was moving toward them through the dark. She thought perhaps it was some new religious movement spreading through the lower Habs, some apocalyptic cult filling young minds with terror. She had reported it to the local ecclesiarchy representative, who had promised to investigate. Nothing came of the investigation, of course. By the time anyone might have taken the children's nightmares seriously, there were more pressing concerns. The fourth week brought the first official acknowledgement that something was wrong. The planetary governor addressed the population via Voxcast, his face projected onto every public screen and broadcast into every Hab unit. He spoke of an approaching Xenos threat, a fleet of unknown origin detected in the outer system. He assured us that the Imperial Navy had been notified, that reinforcements were being dispatched, that Calthran IV was a world of strategic importance and would not be abandoned. He spoke of the Emperor's protection and the strength of our faith. He spoke of the planetary defense forces that stood ready to repel any invasion, of the orbital defense platforms that ringed our world, of the deep void stations that would engage the enemy long before they reached our skies. He spoke for 17 minutes, and by the time he finished, I almost believed him. Almost. But I had seen the monitoring reports by then, had spoken with the cogitator operators who processed the incoming data. The shadow in the void was not a fleet. Fleets have ships, discrete objects that can be counted and classified and engaged. What approached us was a mass, a single vast organism composed of countless smaller organisms, moving with a terrible unified purpose toward our world. The operators showed me the picked captures, grainy images enhanced and processed until they resembled fever dreams more than intelligence reports. I saw shapes that should not have been, biological impossibilities drifting through the vacuum, things that seemed to pulse and shift even in still images. I saw tendrils that stretched for thousands of kilometers, membranes that caught stellar radiation like sails, and at the center of it all, I saw what the operators had begun calling the shadow. It was a darkness so complete that it seemed to drink the light around it, a void within the void, and even rendered as a static image on a flickering screen, it made something deep inside me want to run. I did not run. I went home that night and sat in my small Hab unit and stared at the wall and tried to calculate the implications of what I had seen. The mathematics were simple enough. The mass was approaching at a steady velocity, decelerating as it neared our system. At current speeds, it would reach our world in approximately 10 weeks. 10 weeks to evacuate a planet of 4 billion souls, to dismantle an agricultural infrastructure that fed a dozen systems, to extract decades of accumulated resources and relocate them to safety. It was impossible. Even if every void-capable vessel in the sector had been diverted to evacuation duty, we could not have saved more than a fraction of the population, and vessels were not being diverted. The Navy was mobilizing for combat, preparing to engage the enemy in the void. The ground forces were fortifying positions, establishing defensive perimeters, laying minefields, and constructing bunkers. Everyone was preparing to fight, because fighting was what the Imperium did. We had been raised on stories of glorious last stands, of martyrs who held the line against impossible odds, of faith and fury, triumphing over darkness. No one was preparing to run, because running was not in our vocabulary. Running was cowardice. Running was heresy. Running was abandoning your duty to the Emperor. I began making preparations anyway, quietly, carefully, using the authority of my position to secure passage on outbound cargo vessels, to forge travel permits and evacuation priority documents. I told myself I was doing it for others, that I was trying to save as many as I could. And that was true, partially. I did save some. I arranged passage for 17 members of my staff and their families, for the grey-haired teacher and her students, for a handful of others who came to me with desperation in their eyes and credits to spare. But I also secured passage for myself, a berth on a bulk hauler scheduled to depart 6 weeks hence, carrying the last of the season's grain shipment to the distribution hub at Korvax Station. I told myself it was practical. I told myself my skills would be needed elsewhere, that my knowledge of logistics and distribution could help manage the refugee crisis that was surely coming. I told myself many things, and some of them were even true, but the deepest truth, the one I did not admit, even to myself until much later, was simply this. I did not want to die. I did not want to be consumed. I wanted to live, even if living meant abandoning everything I had ever known and everyone I could not save. The 5th week brought the first engagement. The void stations fired their weapons into the darkness, lance batteries and macro cannons hurling destruction at the approaching mass. We watched the battle on the public screens, grainy picked feeds transmitted from observation platforms in high orbit. We saw the flash of detonations, the bloom of plasma, and the streak of warheads. We saw portions of the mass separate and drift away, burning in the void, dying. A cheer went up from the crowds gathered in the public squares, a desperate hope that perhaps we could win this, that perhaps the enemy was not as invincible as it seemed. I watched in silence. I had seen the scale estimates. I knew that what burned in those picked feeds was the equivalent of trimming a fingernail. The mass would reach us unchanged, undeterred, having lost nothing of consequence. The children stopped eating that week. The grey-haired teacher came to me, her face gaunt with worry, and told me that her students had begun refusing food. They said they could taste it coming, she whispered. They said the hunger was so vast that their own small hungers no longer mattered. I did not know what to tell her. I gave her the evacuation documents I had forged and told her to get her students off-world as quickly as possible. She took the documents with trembling hands and asked me what was coming, what was really coming, and I told her the truth. I told her that I did not know, not really, not in any way that made sense. I told her that something was approaching that did not think as we thought, did not want as we wanted, did not exist as we understood existence. I told her it was a hunger given form, and that everything it touched would become part of that hunger, consumed and incorporated into something beyond our comprehension. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly, and then she turned and walked away to gather her students. I never saw her again. I hope she made it off-world. I hope the children escaped, that they found some corner of the galaxy where the nightmares could not reach them. But I do not know. I will never know. The 6th week brought the first refugees. They came from the outer colonies, the mining stations and research outposts that dotted the moons and asteroids of our system. They came in whatever vessels they could find, packed into cargo holds and shuttle bays, crammed into spaces never meant for human occupation. They came with stories that made no sense, fragments of horror that my mind refused to process. They spoke of landing parties, of organisms that dropped from orbit and burrowed into the ground, of creatures that erupted from beneath the surface and consumed everything they touched. They spoke of spores in the air, of toxins that killed some and transformed others, of people who turned on their neighbors with claws that had not been there moments before. They spoke of a hunger that was not merely physical, that reached into minds and dissolved thoughts, that replaced identity with a single overwhelming imperative to feed. I processed their reports because that was my job. I allocated them to refugee camps because that was my function. I listened to their stories and filed them away in the appropriate cogitator banks because that was what the system required. But at night, alone in my hab unit, I found myself unable to sleep. I found myself staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence of my own breathing, and wondering what it would feel like to have my thoughts dissolved, to have my identity consumed, to become nothing more than fuel for something else's hunger. I found myself understanding, for the first time, why the children had stopped playing. They had seen it coming in their dreams, had felt the weight of that vast hunger pressing against the walls of their minds, and they had known that play and laughter and childhood were luxuries that belonged to a world that was about to end. The 7th week brought the vanguard. They fell from the sky like a rain of nightmares, biological drop pods that screamed through the atmosphere and slammed into the earth with enough force to shake buildings kilometers away. The first impacts were in the outer provinces, the agricultural zones and wilderness preserves far from population centers. We heard the reports come in, frantic Vox transmissions from PDF outposts and civilian settlements. They spoke of creatures beyond description, of chitin and claw and teeth, of things that moved too fast and struck too hard and seemed to feel no pain. They spoke of acid and flame, of weapons that melted flesh and toxins that paralyzed nervous systems. They spoke of the screams that came from the darkness. And then, one by one, they stopped speaking altogether. The Vox channels fell silent, and in their place came only static. And beneath the static, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear something breathing. I had heard recordings from other worlds, archives preserved in the administratum databases, audio fragments recovered from consumed planets. I had not understood them before. They had been sounds without context, noise without meaning, the oral equivalent of looking at a pict capture of an alien landscape. But now, listening to the static that hissed from dead Vox channels, I understood. The breathing beneath the static was not breath at all. It was something else, something vast and patient, something that listened even as we listened, that waited even as we waited. The Tyranid hive mind, the operators called it, though that name seemed too small for what I sensed in those whispers of static. It was not a mind in any sense I understood. It was a hunger that had learned to think, a void that had learned to want, and now it was learning us, studying us, preparing to consume us with the same cold efficiency with which I had once managed grain shipments and water allocations. I should have left that week. My berth on the bulk hauler was still secured, my documents still valid. But the hauler was delayed, its departure pushed back as the military commandeered all available vessels for troop transport and supply runs. The Navy was engaging the main fleet now, throwing everything it had at the mass that hung in our sky like a second moon, bloated and dark and hungry. We watched the battle from the ground, saw the flash of weapons fire reflected in the clouds, saw the trails of debris streaking through the upper atmosphere. We saw ships die, their burning hulks falling toward us like meteors, and we told ourselves that for every Imperial vessel lost, surely 100 of the enemy perished as well. We told ourselves the line would hold, that reinforcements would arrive, that the Emperor would not abandon us. The 8th week brought the rain. Not water, something else, spores, the Medicae units called them, microscopic organisms that drifted down from the bloated mass in orbit, seeding our atmosphere, our soil, our water. Within days, the vegetation began to change. Crops that had been green and healthy yellowed and withered, their cellular structure breaking down, their organic matter being converted into something else. Strange growths appeared in the fields, fleshy protrusions that pulsed with alien life, that released more spores into the air, that spread across the land like a cancer given purpose. The air itself became thick and sweet, carrying a scent that was almost pleasant at first, like overripe fruit, but that grew cloying and then nauseating as the days passed. People began to fall ill. The respirators we had been issued filtered some of the spores, but not all of them, not nearly all of them. I wore my respirator constantly, even sleeping with it strapped to my face, waking in a panic whenever I thought I had felt it slip. I had seen what happened to those who breathed too deeply, who let the spores settle in their lungs and take root. I had seen them in the Medicaid wards, their bodies swelling with alien growths, their minds dissolving into something that was no longer recognizable as human. They did not scream at the end. They smiled, and they whispered about the hunger and how beautiful it was to finally be part of something larger, something eternal, something that would never die because it was always feeding, always growing, always consuming. I saw men and women I had worked with for decades transform into those smiling things, and I understood then that death was not the worst fate waiting for us. Death at least was an ending. What the spores offered was continuation, incorporation, the dissolution of self into an endless collective appetite. The 9th week brought the swarm in earnest. They erupted from the ground where the first vanguard organisms had seeded the earth, burst forth in their millions, in their billions, a tide of chitin and claw that swept across the landscape like water over sand. The PDF lines broke within hours. The fortifications that had taken weeks to construct were overrun in minutes, their defenders consumed, their weapons turned against the next line of resistance. The cities sealed their gates and raised their void shields, and for a time they held, islands of civilization, in a sea of consuming darkness. But the void shields were not designed for this kind of assault. They were meant to deflect orbital bombardment, to hold against energy weapons and kinetic impacts. They could not stop spores from drifting through their permeable membranes, could not prevent the smaller organisms from finding gaps and cracks, from burrowing beneath and emerging within. I was in the administration building when the shield over our city flickered and died. I did not see what killed it. Perhaps the generators failed. Perhaps the operators were overwhelmed. Perhaps the power grid simply could not sustain the constant drain any longer. I only know that one moment the shimmer of the shield was visible in the sky above us, and the next moment it was gone, and with it went our last illusion of safety. The swarm poured through the breach like water through a broken dam, a tide of organisms in every shape and size, from creatures no larger than insects to towering monstrosities that smashed through buildings as if they were made of paper. I ran. Everyone ran. There was nowhere to run to, but we ran anyway, because running was the only response our terrified animal brains could manage. I made it to the bulk hauler more by luck than design. The vessel was preparing for emergency departure, its captain having finally received authorization to lift off despite the ongoing military operations. The cargo bays were being sealed with only a fraction of the intended cargo loaded, and refugees were being turned away at the loading gates, their documents deemed insufficient, their bribes deemed too small. I pushed through the crowd, waving my forged priority authorization, shouting my designation codes until someone opened the gate and dragged me inside. The loading ramp sealed behind me, and I stood in the darkness of the cargo hold, surrounded by crates of grain that would never feed anyone on Calthran IV, and I listened to the screams of those who had not made it through, and I did not weep. I could not weep. I had used up all my tears in the weeks prior, crying alone in my hab unit, while I forged documents and made preparations, and told myself I was doing the right thing. The hauler lifted off 18 minutes after the void shield fell. I felt the engines engage, felt the vessel shudder as it clawed its way upward through an atmosphere thick with spores and debris. I heard the hull groan as something impacted against it, heard the hiss of emergency seals engaging, heard the crew shouting damage reports over the internal voxnet. We were hit 3 times during our ascent, struck by organisms that had been launched from the ground, specifically to intercept fleeing vessels. 2 of the impacts were minor, glancing blows that damaged non-critical systems. The 3rd impact tore through the secondary cargo hold, exposing it to vacuum, killing everyone who had sheltered there. I learned later that 17 people died in that breach, including 4 children. I did not know any of them personally. I was grateful for that. I have enough faces haunting my dreams without adding 17 more. We broke through the upper atmosphere and into the void, and for a moment I thought we had escaped. The stars were visible through the viewing ports in the passenger compartment, cold and distant and beautiful, and I thought perhaps we would make it, perhaps the nightmare was over, perhaps I would live to see another world, and rebuild some semblance of a life. Then the captain announced that we were altering course, that the original route to Korvac's station had been cut off by the enemy fleet, that we would be attempting to reach the nearest Imperial naval presence at Bastion Gloriana. I did not know where Bastion Gloriana was. I did not care. I only knew that we were moving away from Colthran IV, away from the swarm, away from the hunger, and that was enough. I watched my homeworld die through a viewing port no larger than my spread hands. The hauler's trajectory took us past the orbital defense platforms, past the burning husks of Navy vessels, past the vast shadow mass that hung in space like a tumor against the stars. The mass was feeding now. I could see it happening. Tendrils extended down toward the planet, kilometers-long appendages that pierced the atmosphere and connected the mass to the world below. The planet's surface was changing, its familiar greens and blues darkening, its oceans boiling into the void, its landmasses being remade by processes I could not comprehend. It looked, I thought, like a fruit being drained, like something vital was being sucked out of it, leaving only the husk behind. I watched for hours, unable to look away, as the world that had been my home for 63 years was consumed before my eyes. The silence was the worst part. Even through the hull of the vessel, even across the void, I had expected to hear something: screams, explosions, the death throes of a world. But there was nothing, only the hum of the engines, and the whisper of the recycled air, and the distant static that hissed from every vox channel, that breathing beneath the noise that was not breath at all. The planet died in silence, or at least in a silence that I could not penetrate, and I found that absence of sound more horrifying than any scream could have been. 4 billion people lived on that world, 4 billion voices, 4 billion lives, 4 billion stories that would never be told. They were being silenced, one by one, consumed into the vast collective hunger, and there was nothing I could do but watch and remember and promise myself that I would not forget. I have kept that promise. It has been 17 years since Calthran IV fell, and I have not forgotten a single detail of those final weeks. I remember the shadow in the monitoring reports and the children who stopped playing. I remember the grey-haired teacher and her students, the refugees with their impossible stories, the sound of the vox channels falling silent one by one. I remember the taste of recycled air through my respirator and the smell of overripe fruit that carried the spores of our destruction. I remember the face of a woman I did not know, pressed against the gate as it sealed, her mouth open in a scream I could not hear, her eyes wide with a terror that has haunted my dreams every night since. I remember everything, because remembering is the only tribute I can offer to those who did not escape, the only acknowledgement I can make of the 4 billion souls who were consumed so that I might live. They ask me what it was like, the ones who have never seen it, and I tell them it was like watching your own death from a distance, like seeing the shape of your ending laid out before you in perfect clarity and knowing that you could not escape it, that even survival was merely postponement, that the hunger would find you eventually, because the hunger always found everyone. I tell them it was like discovering that everything you believed about the universe was wrong, that there was no order or meaning or purpose, only consumption and the endless cycle of feeding and growing and consuming again. I tell them it was like losing not just a world, but the ability to believe in worlds, in the possibility of home, in the illusion that anywhere could be safe from the darkness that waited between the stars. Most of them do not understand. They nod and look sympathetic and offer hollow words of comfort, and then they return to their lives and their concerns and their small daily struggles, and they forget that somewhere in the galaxy, right now, another world is being consumed. Another 4 billion souls are being silenced. Another survivor is being made who will carry the weight of that witnessing for the rest of their hollow, haunted existence. I do not blame them for forgetting. I envy them, in truth. I envy anyone who can sleep without seeing the children's faces, who can eat without tasting the sweetness of spores, who can look at the stars without seeing the shadow that waits behind them. I was debriefed upon my arrival at Bastion Gloriana, questioned by administratum officials and inquisitorial agents who wanted to know everything I had seen, everything I had learned, everything that might help them predict where the swarm would strike next. I told them about the monitoring reports and the refugees, about the void shield failure and the emergency evacuation. I told them about the shadow mass and the tendrils and the way the planet seemed to be drained rather than destroyed. I told them about the static on the Vox channels and the breathing beneath the noise. They listened and recorded and filed my testimony in whatever archive holds the last words of consumed worlds. And then they released me with a new designation code and a work assignment and instructions to speak of my experiences to no one without proper authorization. I have ignored those instructions, obviously. I have spoken to many people over the past 17 years, survivors like myself and scholars studying the Xenos threat, and ordinary citizens who simply wanted to understand. I have spoken because silence feels too much like complicity, like allowing the hunger to consume not just our worlds but our memories as well. The Imperium wants us to forget, I think. The Administratum files away our testimonies in archives that no one will ever read, and the Ecclesiarchy tells us that faith will protect us, that the Emperor watches over his children, that the martyrs who died on consumed worlds now sit at his right hand in eternal glory. Perhaps that is true. Perhaps the 4 billion souls of Calthron IV are at peace, their suffering ended, their sacrifice meaningful. But I cannot forget the woman's face at the gate, the way her mouth shaped words I could not hear, the terror in her eyes that spoke of no peace, no glory, only the desperate animal need to survive for one more moment, one more breath, one more heartbeat. I think about her often. That woman I did not know. I have given her a name in my memories, a history, a life that she probably never lived, but that I need her to have lived, so that she is not merely a symbol of my guilt. I call her Maren, and I imagine that she was a worker in the manufactorums, that she had a husband who died in the PDF defense and children she was trying to save, that she had done nothing wrong except be born on a world that would one day attract the attention of something vast and hungry. I imagine that she made it to the gate because she was strong and determined and loved her children enough to push through a crowd that was crushing the weak and the slow. I imagine that she saw me pass through the gate, saw my forged priority authorization, saw the path I had bought with credits and connections, and the cold mathematics of survival. I imagine that she understood, in that moment, that I was not better than her, not more deserving, not more valuable to the Imperium or to humanity. I was simply luckier, or more ruthless, or more willing to do what was necessary to live. I imagine that she forgave me. I imagine that, because I cannot bear to imagine the alternative. The hauler made it to Imperial-controlled space, after 3 weeks of travel, jumping through the warp with the special kind of terror that comes from knowing what lurks in that dimension and knowing that our only escape from one nightmare required us to pass through another. I do not remember much of the journey. I spent most of it in a kind of stupor, eating when food was offered and sleeping when exhaustion overwhelmed me and staring at bulkheads when I could do neither. The other refugees mostly left me alone. We all had our own silences to carry, our own memories to process, our own guilt to accommodate. We did not speak of what we had seen because speaking would have made it real in ways that our broken minds could not yet handle. When we arrived at Bastion Gloriana, I was processed through the refugee intake system with the same efficiency I had once applied to grain shipments. I was assigned a bunk in a temporary shelter, a ration card for the commissary, a number to be called when my work assignment was ready. I became a statistic, one among millions of refugees who had fled the swarm's advance, one more displaced soul in an Imperium that produced displaced souls by the trillion. I should have felt diminished by this reduction, insulted by the way my entire life had been distilled into a designation code and a ration allocation. Instead, I felt grateful. I felt relieved. Being a statistic meant not being seen, not being questioned, not being forced to explain why I had survived when so many others had died. I was assigned to the logistics department of a supply depot on Korvac Station, the very destination my original journey had intended. There is a grim irony in that, I suppose, though I no longer have the capacity to appreciate irony. I process shipments now much as I did on Colthran IV, tracking cargo and managing allocations and ensuring that the endless appetite of the Imperial war machine is fed. I am good at my job, or so my supervisors tell me. I work long hours and volunteer for additional shifts and never complain about the conditions or the pay or the food. I work because working keeps me from thinking, and thinking leads to remembering, and remembering leads to the abyss that waits at the edges of my consciousness, the void that whispers, with a voice that is not breath at all. I have not slept well in 17 years. The dreams find me no matter what medications the Medicae officers prescribe, no matter what prayers I offer to an emperor whose silence matches the silence of my consumed world. I dream of the shadow mass, and the tendrils, and the way the planet seemed to shrink as it was drained. I dream of the children standing in the courtyard, their eyes fixed on a sky that held their doom, their small mouths shaping words I could not hear. I dream of Marin at the gate, her face frozen in that moment of desperate terror, her hand reaching toward me as the ramp sealed and the engines engaged, and I left her to die. I dream of the static on the Vox channels and the breathing beneath the noise, and sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I think I can still hear it, that vast and patient presence that watches and waits and hungers. The swarm has consumed 12 more worlds since Calthran IV. I track the reports in the data streams, gathering scraps of information from official bulletins and refugee testimonies and the whispered rumors that spread through the stations and hab blocks of the Imperium's frontier. Each world falls in much the same way, the same pattern of monitoring anomalies and vanguard organisms and spore rain and silence. Each world produces its own handful of survivors, its own cargo of guilt and trauma, its own collection of faces that will haunt someone's dreams for the rest of their diminished life. The Imperium responds with fleets and armies, with virus bombs and exterminatus decrees, with all the terrible weapons of humanity's endless arsenal. Sometimes these responses buy time. Sometimes they save a portion of the population. Sometimes they merely ensure that the world dies by Imperial fire rather than alien hunger, a distinction that matters to the administratum statistics but means nothing to the dead. I received a communication last year from a woman who had escaped one of those consumed worlds. She had found my name in some archive of survivor testimonies, had tracked me down through the labyrinthine channels of Imperial bureaucracy. She wanted to speak with someone who understood, she said. She wanted to talk to someone who had seen what she had seen and survived what she had survived. I agreed to meet her, though I did not know what comfort I could offer. We sat together in a commissary on Korvac Station, surrounded by workers eating their rations and servitors clearing tables, and all the mundane bustle of an Imperium that continues despite everything, and we talked about silence. She told me about her world, a forge colony called Mechanicus Primus VII, about the way the machines had turned against their masters as the spores corrupted their systems, about the screaming that had seemed to come from the walls themselves, as ancient spirits were overwritten by alien imperatives. She told me about her escape, about the pilot who had sacrificed himself to buy time for the shuttle to reach orbit, about the face of her daughter pressed against the viewing port as they broke atmosphere, watching the world that had been her home devour itself. She told me about the dreams, the same dreams I knew so well, the shadow and the tendrils and the hunger that never ended. And then she asked me the question that I have asked myself every day since my own escape, the question that has no answer but that demands to be asked nonetheless. Why did we survive? Why us, specifically, out of the billions who died? What made us deserving of life when so many others were consumed? I told her what I have told myself, though I do not believe it any more than she did. I told her that survival is not about deserving, that there is no cosmic calculus that weighs our worth against the worth of those who perished. I told her that we survived because of luck and timing and the random accidents of fate that placed us near escape routes and far from the worst of the swarm's advance. I told her that our survival means nothing beyond itself, that we are not special or chosen or blessed, that we are simply the ones who happen to be in the right place at the right moment to slip through the closing jaws of annihilation. I told her that guilt is the price of survival, the tax that the universe demands from those who live when they should have died, and that the only thing we can do is keep living, keep remembering, keep bearing witness to what we have seen, so that those who come after us might understand what we lost. She did not believe me. I could see it in her eyes, the same emptiness I see in my own reflection, the same hollow certainty that our survival was a mistake, that we were meant to die with our worlds and our people, that living is a kind of betrayal of those who were consumed. We sat together in that commissary, two survivors surrounded by people who did not understand, who could not understand, and we shared a silence that was more eloquent than any words could have been. When she left, she thanked me for talking with her. She said it helped, knowing that someone else understood. I do not think it helped. I do not think anything helps. But sometimes the illusion of help is all we have. I am 63 years old. I was 31 when I became a logistics coordinator, 46 when I watched my world die, and 63 now as I set down these words for whoever might find them after I am gone. I do not know how much longer I will live. The medications I take for sleep have begun to damage my liver, and the stress of constant nightmares has worn my heart to the point where the Medicaid officers speak of it in hushed, concerned tones. I do not fear death. Death would be a release, an ending to the memories and the guilt and the endless weight of survival. What I fear is something else, something that has grown in me over the 17 years since Calthron IV, a suspicion that I cannot shake, no matter how many prayers I offer, or how many hours I work, or how many medications I swallow. I fear that the hunger heard me. I fear that in those final moments before the hauler broke through the atmosphere, when I was pressed against the viewing port staring at the shadow mass, the hunger looked back. I fear that it knows me now, that it remembers me, that somewhere in the vast collective consciousness of the swarm, there is an awareness of Aldrin Voss, regional logistics coordinator, survivor, witness. I fear that it is patient, that it can wait decades or centuries or millennia for its hunger to be satisfied, and that one day, no matter how far I run or how well I hide, it will find me. I fear that the breathing beneath the static that I hear in my dreams is not a memory but a message, a promise, a reminder that I am not truly escaped, only postponed. Perhaps I am mad. Perhaps the trauma of what I witnessed has broken something in my mind, has filled the cracks with paranoid fantasies and cosmic delusions. The Medicaid officers certainly think so, though they are too professional to say it directly. They prescribe stronger medications and suggest therapy sessions, and remind me that the Xenos threat, while terrible, is ultimately just another enemy to be fought and defeated, no different from the heretic, or the traitor, or the countless other dangers that humanity faces across the galaxy. They tell me that the Imperium has stood for 10,000 years against threats that make the Tyranid swarms seem small, and that it will stand for 10,000 more, and that the Emperor protects, and that faith is the shield that no enemy can penetrate. I listen to their words and I nod, and I take their medications, and I return to my bunk, and I stare at the ceiling, and I wait for sleep to find me, knowing that when it does, the dreams will be waiting. The shadow and the tendrils and the face at the gate, the children in the courtyard, the silence that spread across a world like a tide, drowning every voice, every scream, every whisper of hope, the static on the Vox channels, and the breathing beneath the noise, the knowledge that I am alone, utterly alone, in a universe that cares nothing for my survival or my guilt or my desperate need to believe that what I experienced meant something, that the 4 billion souls of Calthron IV did not die for nothing, that their consumption served some purpose beyond feeding an endless hunger. I do not believe in purpose anymore. I do not believe in meaning or hope or the Emperor's protection. I believe only in the hunger, in its patience, in its vastness, in the certainty that it will come again, that it always comes again, That somewhere in the galaxy right now, another shadow is drifting toward another world. Another 4 billion souls are living their last weeks without knowing it. Another survivor is being made who will carry the weight of witnessing for the rest of their diminished life. I believe in the silence that follows consumption, the absence that is more terrible than any presence, the void that wears a face of 1,000,000,000,000 faces, all of them screaming, all of them smiling, all of them whispering about the beauty of being part of something larger. They ask me what it is like to watch a planet fall to the Xenos swarm, and I tell them the truth. It is like being hollowed out from the inside, like having your soul scooped away and replaced with static. It is like learning that everything you loved was merely food waiting to be eaten, that everything you built was merely architecture waiting to be consumed, that everyone you knew was merely flesh waiting to be incorporated into something vast and hungry and eternal. It is like discovering that the universe has no flaw, that you can fall forever and never hit bottom, that there is always a deeper darkness waiting below the darkness you know. It is like dying and surviving at the same time, like being erased and preserved in the same moment, like becoming a ghost haunting your own continued existence. It is like watching your own death from a distance and knowing that the distance is an illusion, that the death is still coming, that survival is merely postponement, that the hunger will find you eventually, because the hunger always finds everyone. It is silence. It is the silence of 4 billion voices swallowed whole, and it never, ever ends.